In part 2 of our series on the peripheral nervous system, we're going to look at the opposite of the somatic nervous system, which is what we call the autonomic nervous system. From the prefix auto, it should be obvious that instead of looking at the voluntary control, we are going to be focusing on the regulation of involuntary processes in the human body, such as regulation of heartbeat and rates of involuntary breathing. It should come as no surprise, given its importance in regulating other homeostatic processes, that the hypothalamus is a major regulatory center, as it's largely responsible for regulating hormone levels, including levels of certain neurotransmitters. But the primary location of regulation is a very ancient part of the human brain, evolutionarily speaking, called the medulla oblongata, which is found at the base of the brainstem and at the top of the spinal cord, and is one of the most critical parts of the brain for regulating basic human survival. Now, depending on what the stimulus is that triggers the autonomic nervous system to response, it can trigger one of two contradictory responses, the first of which we've actually been introduced to, which is what we call the sympathetic nervous system, also responsible for regulating the fight or flight response, as we were introduced to it when we talked about adrenaline. And whenever the human body recognizes a source of extreme danger or anything that it perceives as a threat, it can trigger a number of systemic changes which are regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, when facing down danger, the first key to survival is being able to identify the source and location of that danger, and you can't fight or run away from something that you cannot see. So the first change that typically occurs is dilation of the pupils, which causes the muscles that control the openings to the eyes to expand outward, allowing more light to be able to enter the eyes. As a result of this, human vision, specifically peripheral vision, expands outward, allowing humans to see a greater field of view and making it more easy to identify the location and source of danger in order to figure out how to respond correctly. Now, the two most obvious locations that are regulated by a sympathetic nervous system response are the heart and the lungs because of their essential nature in terms of survival. Naturally, if you want to fight or run away from extreme danger, the main thing that you'll want to regulate is the heartbeat, specifically to increase it, causing blood to travel faster. And since blood is responsible for transporting nutrients that cells need to produce energy and oxygen that they need for basic survival, it will make sense that your heartbeat will want to beat faster to transport nutrients and oxygen to where they want to go. But obviously the lungs are connected to this because without the lungs we wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen that we need. So one of the other functions of the sympathetic nervous system response is dilation of the bronchioles, meaning that all of the tubes that hold oxygen and transport oxygen from the trachea to the alveoli at the end of the lungs dilate, causing lung volume to increase drastically. This means that there is more space that occurs within the lungs, which means that more oxygen can now be absorbed when you breathe into the lungs, transferred to the circulatory system, and pumped to the organs where they now need to go. Now, as for other organs that are inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system response, the primary location that you don't want to be using as you are fighting for your life or running for your life is digestion. When you're in the middle of fighting or running, your body doesn't have enough time or energy to get nutrients directly out of food that you may have eaten, and digestion also consumes a lot of water in the hydrolysis of food that you've eaten, as well as a lot of ATP that is specifically used for peristalsis, that being the muscular contractions of the stomach and intestines, your body needs to put the ATP to use in muscle movement and the water into use in other regulatory processes, and shutting off digestion in the event of an emergency response is one way to conserve a huge amount of water and redirect ATP to other parts of the body that are needed. One of the most obvious symptoms you'll notice during a sympathetic response is dry mouth, because the production of saliva stops entirely, and again, this is due to the bodily need to conserve water. Now, why would your body need water in the case of an emergency? The first of which is lubrication of muscles to make sure that your muscles and bones don't damage each other through friction, and also in the purpose of temperature control, because if you're running or fighting for your life, you're probably going to be sweating a fair bit in order to prevent your body from overheating too much. Now, one part of the body that we definitely do not want to turn off is the liver, because of its importance as the repository of glycogen in the body. So one of the things that occurs in the liver is the breakdown of glycogen, mediated, of course, by glucagon produced by the pancreas. And glycogen, when broken down into glucose, creates another primary energy source that is then circulated through the body to allow your cells to produce more ATP. Now, as mentioned previously, the sympathetic nervous system response is regulated by the hormone adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. And adrenaline is not produced in the hypothalamus, but its production is regulated by the hypothalamus, but it's produced in a pair of glands, which are what we call the adrenal or adrenal glands, located above the kidney, which produce more adrenaline and therefore trigger a stronger sympathetic response. Additionally, there are a few other locations that may have peripheral importance depending on the situation. Now, generally, any muscles that are non-essential for the purpose of survival have ATP redirected away from them, including muscles that occur in the bladder. So one of the symptoms that may occur when you are in the middle of running or fighting for your life is peeing your pants, because of the fact that the muscles in your bladder relax, because again, ATP needs to be conserved and only consumed in parts of the body that are essential for survival. But because of relaxation of the muscles in the bladder, this makes urination a lot easier to do. Now, depending on the situation that triggers a nervous system response or a sympathetic nervous system response, one of the other effects that actually occurs as a side effect is the achievement of sexual climax, also called an orgasm. But once again, this occurring depends on what the actual stimulus is that triggers a sympathetic response. Now, if you think about all of the effects of a sympathetic response, none of these are sustainable. The human body cannot sustain high breathing and heart rates for a prolonged period of time, because your body is burning through its natural resources, which means after a sympathetic response has subsided, the opposite of a sympathetic response, what we call the parasympathetic response, usually comes in and overrides this. And again, this is meant to help the body replenish its water supply and its reserves of nutrients, which would be depleted after a sympathetic response. Now, naturally, after you've been running or fighting for your life, the first thing that you'll probably want to do is sleep. And again, to replenish the water and nutrients that your body has lost, you'll probably want to eat and drink some food, which is why this is colloquially known as the rest and digest response. And pretty much all of the bodily effects are the opposite as what we see in the sympathetic response. The pupils in our eyes contract, and this is for a very simple reason. because the pupils have now gotten smaller, less light can now enter the eyes, because as we know, we don't want to look directly at the sun for too long because too much light can actually damage the eyes. So pupil contraction is meant to protect the retina and stop too much light from burning out the inside of our eyes. Next, obviously, heart rate is going to slow down so that less ATP is consumed, and if the heart becomes overworked and stopped, this is of course what we call a heart attack, or more correctly, cardiac arrest. And cardiac arrest, let's spell cardiac properly, cardiac arrest can easily lead to death if the heart becomes overworked. Now, because the body is not needing to pump oxygen as much, lung volume is also going to decrease, meaning the bronchioles, the tubes inside of our lungs, contract. And again, the primary need for this is that we need less oxygen in order to make ATP because we're resting now in order to recover our energy reserves. Now, speaking of energy reserves, the liver is going to increasingly absorb more glucose and convert it to glycogen in order to replenish its energy reserves. However, obviously, if we aren't eating any food, then we aren't going to be able to store any glycogen, which means that our stomach and intestines begin digestion again because all of our long-term and short-term energy reserves need to be replenished, hence the reabsorption of glucose and stored as glycogen. During a rest and digest response, our saliva production also resumes, and again, this saliva production is needed to lubricate food so that we can swallow it, and also in the hydrolysis of food that we need to digest food. Now, in terms of the actual mediation of the parasympathetic response, the opposite hormone of adrenaline is actually acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a very flexible hormone in the body because not only is it used to regulate voluntary muscle control, but it also is the inhibitory hormone for the adrenal glands that signals to the shutoff of the production of adrenaline and therefore the shutdown of the sympathetic response. This concludes our video series on the peripheral nervous system. You can take a look at this case study here involving post-traumatic stress disorder, which frequently involves soldiers or survivors of very deadly conflicts or deadly encounters from triggering uncharacteristically abnormal sympathetic responses, and frequently involves disorders of the autonomic nervous system's regulation. So see if you can put your knowledge of the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses to answer questions involving this case study here.